over the last week or so, Israel has surged aid into Gaza. They've now allowed in, the IDF has said, about 400 trucks a day, which is close to what was going in before the war, and it had been much lower previously in the conflict. Israel announced earlier this week as well that they would build a northern crossing that would allow aid to get from Israel into Gaza in the northern part of Gaza, which is where aid is most desperately needed. And Israel said that they would allow the use of their Ashdod port, which is just north of Gaza, as a way to allow aid to get into Gaza via the Mediterranean Sea and then transported by land from that port into Gaza. So all of this happened, if you connect the dots, through President Biden, through the threat he made to condition his aid to Israel based on the, as they said, concrete steps that they wanted to see Israel take.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, when last we talked, President Joe Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, they had a very tense phone call, at least the way the White House portrayed it, and there were some demands or requests made. What's the status of some of those action items?
So, to set the context around this call, it's important to remember that this call took place after the accidental Israeli airstrike that killed 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers. And so this air strike, where Israel has since acknowledged that they were wrong, that they targeted civilians, and they fired 2 of the commanders involved in the decision-making, that happened. There was international outrage. And then during this call between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu, for the first time we were told, the White House publicly said that they would consider changing their policy position, their stance on it, providing military aid to Israel. And so, while I didn't say they were reconsidering it, simply the threat of potentially reconsidering their stance on aid was a major symbolic move that actually got the Israelis to do what the U.S. has asked them to do for months. And so over the last week or so, Israel has surged aid into Gaza. They've now allowed in, the IDF has said, about 400 trucks a day, which is close to what was going in before the war, and it had been much lower previously in the conflict. Israel announced earlier this week as well that they would build a northern crossing that would allow aid to get from Israel into Gaza in the northern part of Gaza, which is where aid is most desperately needed. And Israel said that they would allow the use of their Ashdod port, which is just north of Gaza, as a way to allow aid to get into Gaza via the Mediterranean Sea and then transported by land from that port into Gaza. So all of this happened, if you connect the dots, through President Biden, through the threat he made to condition his aid to Israel based on the, as they said, concrete steps that they wanted to see Israel take. And so far, over the course of this week, we've heard U.S. officials acknowledge that they've seen these steps, but say they want to see a sustained effort.
Where do things stand with the ceasefire negotiations?
That's a great question. CIA Director Bill Burns was in Cairo earlier this week for the latest talks. And so he presented a plan to the Egyptian and Qatari representatives, who then brought it to Hamas.
Right.
And so this proposal included 6 weeks or so of a ceasefire, where Israel and international organizations would flood Gaza with much-needed humanitarian aid. And in the first parts of this stoppage, Israel wants to see 40 of the about 100 remaining hostages released. And this is where things get tricky,
right,
because we heard reports that Hamas isn't sure that they have 40 hostages that meet the criteria for this first group of people that Israel wants released. This first group of people includes women, includes men over the age of 50 who are considered not in fighting age,
right,
and then younger men who are in need of medical attention. And so these reports that Hamas doesn't have 40 people that meet this criteria set off some alarm bells, because it represents the possibility that had not yet been reported that more hostages than we're aware of could be dead at this point.
Right.
And so Israel still wants to get their bodies back regardless of whether or not they're dead or alive, but it changes the some of the questions involved in these negotiations. And so while we're hearing that progress is being made, it's still the final hurdle that they've been able to get over in the past that they still haven't yet cleared.
So as these negotiations take place and these reports are emerging, what kind of offensive maneuvers has Israel still have ongoing?
So they're carrying out limited operations, mainly in South and somewhat in Central Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've talked a lot about Israel's intention to go into the southern city of Rafah.
Right.
The U.S. still is opposed to such a plan because more than 1 million Palestinians have fled there over the course of the war. So there's now the largest concentration of Palestinians in this city that Israel wants to conduct operations in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why does Israel want to conduct operations? Because this is where the remaining Hamas battalions that they've not yet destroyed are sheltering.
Mm-hmm.
And so from an Israeli perspective, this is the last remaining major battle that they see that they have to conduct with Hamas to complete their military objectives. But they believe they have to go in at full force, and the U.S. and other Western countries have said doing so poses grave risk to the civilians that are there. And so Israel says that they will evacuate them, but it's not clear how you evacuate more than 1 million people, especially given the destruction that we've seen throughout the rest of the Strip, where they would be evacuated to. And so the U.S. hasn't seen a plan that they call credible from the Israelis about how they would adequately support all of the displaced Palestinians that were in northern Gaza, traveled to Rafah to avoid the war, and will now be evacuated for this potential operation.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.